The wagon wheel cracked on the 13th day west of St. Louis, and Eleanor Hayes watched her last hope of reaching California with the main wagon train disappear into a cloud of prairie dust as the other families rolled forward without stopping. She stood beside the broken wheel in her traveling dress, now stained with mud and sweat, clutching the only possession she had carried all the way from Philadelphia, a quilt her mother had sewn during the final months before the fever took her. The quilt was pieced from fabric scraps that told the story of Eleanor's childhood, each square a memory stitched with love. Her mother had pressed it into her hands 3 years ago in 1870, whispering that it would keep her warm no matter how far she traveled. Eleanor had not imagined then that she would travel this far, or that she would be so utterly alone. The wagon master had been apologetic but firm. They could not wait for repairs. The season was advancing, and snow in the mountain passes meant death for everyone. He left her with the broken wagon, the 2 exhausted oxen, and directions to a town called Sweetwater Creek that supposedly lay 20 miles south. A town meant a blacksmith, he said. A blacksmith meant a new wheel. She could catch up with another train passing through, he assured her, though his eyes had not met hers when he spoke. Eleanor watched until the wagon train became a smudge on the horizon, then turned to examine her situation. The oxen were too tired to pull the heavy wagon even if the wheel were whole. She had enough food for perhaps a week if she rationed carefully. Water for 3 days. The September sun beat down on the endless grass of the Nebraska territory, and she had no clear idea which direction would take her to Sweetwater Creek. She unhitched the oxen and let them graze while she salvaged what she could carry. A canteen, a small sack of cornmeal and dried beef. A tin cup and plate, a knife, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and the quilt, which she rolled tightly and tied across her shoulders like a bedroll. Everything else would have to stay with the wagon. Her books, her mother's china, the daguerreotype of her father who had died when she was 7, all of it too heavy for the journey ahead. By the time she started walking, the sun had passed its zenith. She chose south because the wagon master had said south, and because staying with the broken wagon meant dying of thirst or starvation or worse. She had heard stories about what happened to women alone on the prairie. The wagon train had lost 2 men to Lakota raids in Wyoming, though others insisted the Lakota had only been trying to trade. Eleanor did not know what to believe. She only knew that she had to keep moving. The prairie grass whispered around her legs as she walked. The sky stretched enormous and blue overhead, empty of clouds. Her boots, made for city streets, rubbed blisters on her heels within the first hour. By the 3rd hour, every step burned. She forced herself to continue, counting steps to give her mind something to hold on to. 100 steps, then rest. 100 more steps, then a sip of water. She made a game of it, the way her mother had made a game of learning sums when Eleanor was small. The sun dropped toward the western horizon, painting the sky orange and pink and purple. Eleanor had never seen such colors in Philadelphia. Despite her exhaustion and fear, she found herself stopping to stare at the beauty of it. The land here seemed to swallow people whole, but it gave them sunsets that looked like the very doors of heaven opening wide. She walked until the light failed completely, then stopped because stumbling in darkness seemed foolish. She had seen no sign of the town, no smoke from chimneys, no distant lights. Only grass and more grass rolling away in every direction. She made a cold camp in a small depression between 2 low hills, hoping it would hide her from whatever eyes might be watching in the night. Eleanor wrapped herself in the quilt and tried to sleep, but every sound jerked her awake. The wind in the grass sounded like footsteps. A coyote howled in the distance and others answered. She gripped her knife and waited for dawn, shivering despite the quilt's warmth. Morning came slowly, gray and cool. Eleanor's body ached from sleeping on the ground. Her feet throbbed with fresh blisters. She ate a strip of dried beef and a handful of cornmeal mixed with water, then started walking again. South, always south, though she had no way to be certain she was still traveling in the right direction. The land began to change as the day wore on. The endless flat prairie gave way to rolling hills cut through with small creeks lined with cottonwood trees. Eleanor filled her canteen at the first creek she found, blessing the wagon master for teaching her to boil water before drinking when possible. She could not risk a fire during the day, not without knowing who might see the smoke, but she made note of the landmarks. A lightning-struck tree, a pile of rocks that looked almost like a cairn. She would return at nightfall if she found no town. She crested a hill in late afternoon and saw, in the valley below, a thin column of smoke rising from a stand of trees near a creek. Her heart jumped. A town, or at least a homestead. She hurried forward, half-running despite her blistered feet, hope giving her strength. But as she drew closer, she realized it was no town. Just a single cabin of rough-cut logs, a small barn, and a corral holding 4 horses. The smoke came from the cabin's chimney. Eleanor hesitated at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain. A lone woman approaching a stranger's homestead was taking a terrible risk. But what choice did she have? She needed directions, and her water was running low again. She was still standing there, trying to decide when a man emerged from the barn. He stopped when he saw her, and his hand went immediately to the gun on his hip. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. They stared at each other across 50 yards of dusty ground. The man was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and a dark shirt. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but Eleanor could see he was young, probably not much older than her own 22 years. He did not draw the gun, but he did not take his hand away from it either. "You lost," he called out. His voice was rough, as if he did not use it often. "Yes," Eleanor said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I am looking for Sweetwater Creek. I was told it was 20 miles south of the Oregon Trail, but I have been walking for 2 days." The man stepped forward slowly, studying her. His eyes were blue, she saw as he came closer, startling against his sun-darkened skin. His hair was brown and shaggy, falling past his collar. He needed a shave, but his face was not unkind. "You walked from the trail?" he asked. "Alone. My wagon broke down. The train could not wait." Eleanor pulled the quilt bundle higher on her shoulders. "I have money. I can pay if you will tell me how to reach the town." The cowboy removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. He looked tired, Eleanor thought, and perhaps a little sad. "Sweetwater Creek is another 15 miles south and west," he said. "Maybe more. You would not make it before dark, and there are wolves in these hills at night. Pack hunters." Eleanor's heart sank. "Then I will impose on your hospitality for directions and fresh water and be on my way." "It will be dark in 2 hours," he said. He glanced at her feet, and she knew he could see how she was standing, favoring her left side where the worst blisters burned. "You can stay in the barn tonight. I will give you a horse in the morning to reach town." "I cannot accept charity," Eleanor said stiffly. Philadelphia propriety demanded she refuse, even though every part of her screamed to accept. "It is not charity. I will trade you." His eyes flicked to the quilt. "That looks warm. Winter comes early here. I could use a good blanket." Eleanor's hands tightened on the fabric. Her mother's quilt, the last piece of home she possessed. But what good was sentiment if she died trying to walk another 15 miles on ruined feet, and he was offering a horse? A horse meant survival. "No," she heard herself say, "not the quilt. I will work instead. I can cook and clean, I can mend and sew. Let me work for the horse." The cowboy studied her for a long moment, then he nodded. "Fair enough. 1 week of work for the horse and directions. My name is Caleb Stone, Eleanor Hayes." She limped forward and extended her hand. He shook it gravely, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. Caleb Stone led her to the cabin and showed her inside. It was a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed in one corner, a rough table with 2 chairs, and not much else. Clean, though. Surprisingly clean for a bachelor's quarters. A pot of something was simmering over the fire, and the smell made Eleanor's stomach clench with hunger. "I've got stew," Caleb said. "Nothing fancy. You are welcome to it." He ladled the stew into 2 tin bowls and they ate in silence. Eleanor tried not to gulp the food, though she wanted to. It was simple fare, rabbit and turnips and wild onions, but it was the best thing she had tasted in weeks. When she finished, Caleb refilled her bowl without asking. "You came from Philadelphia?" he asked, surprising her. She had not mentioned the city. "Yes, how did you know? Your accent, and your dress." He gestured at her traveling costume, which had probably been fine for boarding a train but was utterly impractical for the frontier. "What brings a Philadelphia lady all the way out here?" Eleanor set down her spoon. "I was going to California. My aunt lives in Sacramento. She wrote to me after my mother died and offered me a home. I sold everything we had to buy passage on the wagon train. And now I suppose I will find work in Sweetwater Creek and save money for another wagon train in the spring." She said it firmly, as if speaking it aloud would make it true. Caleb nodded slowly. "Sweetwater Creek is not much of a town, maybe 200 people, most of them ranchers and cowboys. But there is a general store and a boarding house. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Chen, might need help. She is getting on in years." "Thank you." Eleanor met his eyes. "You have been very kind, Mr. Stone. I will work hard this week to earn the horse." "I believe you will," Caleb said. He stood and collected the bowls. "The barn has clean straw in the loft. I will bring you blankets." "The quilt will be enough," Eleanor said quickly. "I do not need your blankets." He looked at her and something shifted in his expression. "Keep your quilt, Miss Hayes. I have blankets to spare." That night, Eleanor climbed into the barn loft and made a nest in the sweet-smelling hay. Caleb had been true to his word, bringing her 2 wool blankets and a pillow stuffed with feathers. She wrapped herself in her mother's quilt anyway, drawing comfort from the familiar fabric, and fell asleep listening to the horses moving in their stalls below. She woke before dawn to the sound of Caleb moving around the barn. Through the gaps in the loft floor, she could see him feeding and watering the horses, his movements efficient and gentle. He spoke softly to the animals and they nickered in response, clearly comfortable with him. Eleanor climbed down the ladder, brushing hay from her hair and dress. Caleb glanced up when he heard her. "Morning," he said. "There is a creek behind the cabin if you want to wash. I will make breakfast." The water in the creek was shockingly cold, but Eleanor welcomed it. She washed her face and hands, then examined her feet. The blisters were worse than she had feared, some of them broken and weeping. She tore strips from her petticoat and bound them as best she could, gritting her teeth against the pain. When she returned to the cabin, Caleb had laid out a simple breakfast of fried cornmeal cakes and the last of the rabbit stew. He looked at her feet as she limped in, but said nothing. After they ate, he showed her around the homestead. "I run cattle," he explained. "About 100 head right now, scattered over the hills. I check on them every day, move them to fresh grass, watch for predators and sickness. It is just me, so it keeps me busy." "No hands?" Eleanor asked. Most ranches she had heard of employed several cowboys. "Cannot afford them." "I am still building this place, maybe in a few years." He paused by the corral. "You said you could cook and clean. I am no good at either. If you could handle the cabin and the cooking this week, that would be worth a horse in itself." Eleanor agreed readily. Cooking and cleaning were skills she had, and the work would help her feel less like a burden. Caleb saddled one of the horses and rode out to check his cattle, and Eleanor set about exploring the cabin. It was, as she had noted the night before, surprisingly clean but also surprisingly empty. No photographs, no decorations, nothing personal except a small wooden cross hanging above the bed. The pantry held basic supplies: cornmeal, flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar. She found wild onions and turnips in a root cellar. Not much to work with, but she had managed with less. She swept the cabin floor and beat the dust from the blankets on the bed. She found his spare shirts and pants folded on a shelf and saw that several needed mending. She located a needle and thread in a small box on the table, likely used for repairing tack, and settled into one of the chairs to work. The rhythm of sewing calmed her. Her mother had taught her fine needlework. And though mending a cowboy's work shirt was far from the embroidery samplers she had stitched as a girl, the motion was the same. In and out, making small broken things whole again. Caleb returned at midday, dusty and tired. Eleanor had beans soaking and bread dough rising, though the bread would not be ready until evening. She made him a plate of cold cornmeal cakes and onions fried in a little bacon fat, and he ate with obvious appreciation. "You can really cook," he said, sounding surprised. "Did you think I was lying?" Eleanor asked, amused despite herself. "No, I just thought maybe a city lady would only know fancy cooking, not frontier food." "My mother and I were not wealthy," Eleanor said quietly. "After my father died, we had very little. I learned to make much from little." Caleb nodded and said nothing more, but Eleanor thought she saw understanding in his eyes. The week developed a rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn, did the necessary chores around the homestead, and then rode out to tend his cattle. Eleanor cooked and cleaned, mended his clothes, and slowly learned the geography of this new life. She baked bread every other day. She made stews and fried cakes, and even managed a passable pie with wild plums Caleb picked from a thicket down by the creek. Her feet healed slowly, though the scars would remain. They spoke little at first. Caleb seemed unused to conversation, and Eleanor was wary of saying too much to a strange man. But gradually, over shared meals and evening hours sitting outside the cabin watching the sunset, they began to talk. She learned that Caleb had fought in the war as a very young man, barely 16 when he lied about his age to join the Union Army. He had seen things he did not want to speak about, and after the war ended, he drifted west, because staying in Ohio with his memories seemed impossible. He homesteaded this land 3 years ago, built the cabin with his own hands, and slowly accumulated the cattle that would, he hoped, make him a living. "It is quiet here," he said one evening as they sat on the cabin step, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I like the quiet." Eleanor understood. She had craved noise and company in the weeks on the wagon train, the constant presence of other families around her. But here, in the vast silence of the prairie night, she felt something else, a kind of peace she had not known since her mother died. As if the land itself was big enough to hold all her grief without being crushed by it. "I like it too," she admitted. "I thought I would be frightened, being so far from cities and people, but it is not frightening. It is just different." Caleb glanced at her. In the dim light, his face was all angles and shadows. "You are not what I expected when I saw you standing at the edge of the clearing." "What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone who would scream or faint or cry. A lot of women do when they first get out here and realize how empty it is." "I cried plenty on the walk from the wagon," Eleanor said. "I just did not let you see it." He smiled at that, a rare expression that transformed his face. "Fair enough." The week passed faster than Eleanor had imagined possible. On the 7th day, Caleb saddled a gentle mare named Rosie and helped Eleanor prepare for the ride to Sweetwater Creek. "The trail is clear," he said, pointing south and west. "Follow the creek for about 5 miles, then head toward that notch in the hills. You will see the town from there. Give Rosie to Mrs. Chen at the boarding house. Tell her I will come get her next time I am in town." Eleanor tied her few possessions in a bundle with the quilt. She had washed and mended her dress as best she could, but she knew she still looked like what she was. A woman who had lost everything and was starting over with nothing. She turned to Caleb, suddenly reluctant to leave. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. You saved my life." "You earned the horse," Caleb said, but his voice was rough again, the way it had been that first day. "Take care, Miss Hayes." Eleanor mounted Rosie, settling her bundle across the saddle. She looked down at Caleb, this strange, quiet man who had shown her unexpected kindness. "Will I see you again?" "I come to town once a month for supplies. Maybe." It was not a promise, but it was something. Eleanor nodded, turned Rosie's head toward the south, and rode away. She looked back once from the top of the first hill and saw Caleb still standing in the yard, watching her go. Sweetwater Creek was exactly as Caleb had described, a small cluster of buildings around a single main street. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church, a bank no bigger than a shed, and the boarding house, a two-story structure that dwarfed everything else. Eleanor rode directly to the boarding house and tied Rosie to the hitching post. Mrs. Chen answered the door herself. She was a small Chinese woman with silver-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked Eleanor up and down, taking in the travel-stained dress and the tired horse and the bundle that held all of Eleanor's worldly possessions. "You are looking for work or for a room?" she asked. Her English was accented but clear. "Both, if possible," Eleanor said. "Caleb Stone said you might need help. He lent me the horse to get here. He said he would collect her next time he is in town." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly at Caleb's name. "Caleb is a good man. You stayed at his place for a week. I worked for him in exchange for the horse, Mrs. Chen studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "Come in, we will talk." The boarding house was clean and well kept, with 8 guest rooms upstairs and a large dining room and kitchen downstairs. Mrs. Chen explained that she fed her boarders 2 meals a day and did their laundry for an additional charge. She was getting older, she said, and the work was becoming difficult. "I can pay you $3 a week plus room and board," Mrs. Chen said. "You will cook, clean the guest rooms, and help with laundry. It is hard work." "I am not afraid of hard work," Eleanor said. "When can I start?" "Now." Mrs. Chen smiled properly for the first time. "Welcome to Sweetwater Creek, Miss Hayes." Eleanor fell into the work with relief. It was hard, just as Mrs. Chen had promised, but it was honest and it gave her purpose. She rose before dawn to start breakfast for the boarders, a rotating cast of cowboys, traveling salesmen, and occasional families passing through. She cleaned rooms and washed sheets and scrubbed floors. At night, she fell into bed in her tiny room at the back of the 2nd floor, too tired to do anything but sleep. The town slowly revealed itself to her. Mr. Patterson ran the general store with his silent wife. The blacksmith was a huge German man named Klaus, who spoke more to his horses than to people. The saloon was owned by a woman, shockingly, a hard-faced blonde named Alice, who had come west as a dance hall girl and saved enough money to buy the place. The church had no regular preacher, but a circuit rider came through once a month to perform marriages and baptisms. Eleanor had been in Sweetwater Creek for 3 weeks when Caleb rode into town. She was hanging laundry behind the boarding house when she heard Rosie's distinctive whinny. Her heart jumped in a way that surprised her, and she hurried around to the front. Caleb was dismounting in the street, and he looked up as she approached. Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to name. "Miss Hayes," he said, "you are still here. Where else would I be?" Eleanor asked. She was suddenly, painfully aware of how she must look, with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose from its pins and water stains on her apron. "I thought you might have moved on, taken another wagon train west. There have been no trains through here." "It is too late in the season." Eleanor clasped her hands together to keep them still. "How are you? How is the ranch?" "Fine, both fine." Caleb glanced toward the boarding house. "I came for supplies and to collect Rosie. I should get to it." He started to turn away, and Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. "Mr. Stone," she said, and he stopped. "Would you like dinner? Mrs. Chen serves at 6. You are welcome at our table." Caleb hesitated, and Eleanor was certain he would refuse. Then he nodded. "That would be nice, thank you." He returned at 6, washed and shaved, looking younger and less weathered without the trail dust. Mrs. Chen seated him at the large table with the other boarders, and Eleanor served roast chicken and potatoes and carrots, the best meal she could manage on short notice. She caught Caleb watching her several times during the meal, and each time their eyes met, she felt her face grow warm. What was wrong with her? She had known this man for barely more than a week. She had no claim on him, no reason to feel this strange pull in her chest every time she looked at him. After dinner, Caleb lingered while the other boarders dispersed. Eleanor was clearing the table when he approached. "That was a fine meal," he said. "Better than anything I have managed since you left. I am glad you enjoyed it." Eleanor set down the stack of plates. "I wanted to thank you again. Mrs. Chen has been good to me, and I have this job because you sent me to her. You have the job because you earned it." Caleb twisted his hat in his hands. "Miss Hayes, I wonder if I could ask you something?" "Of course. Would you walk with me, just for a little while?" Eleanor glanced toward the kitchen, where Mrs. Chen was washing dishes. The older woman caught her eye and made a small shooing motion. Eleanor untied her apron, hung it on a hook, and followed Caleb outside. They walked down the main street as the sun set, painting the sky with those same impossible colors Eleanor had first seen from the prairie. Caleb was silent for a long time, and Eleanor let him be, sensing that he was working up to something. "I have been thinking," he said finally, "about the week you stayed at my place. The cabin felt different with you there, more like a home and less like just a place to sleep." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. "I enjoyed being there, it was peaceful." "I am not good with words," Caleb said. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I am just a cowboy with a small ranch and not much money. But I am a hard worker and I am honest and I do not drink or gamble. I know we have not known each other long, but I cannot stop thinking about you. If you would consider it, I would like to court you properly." Eleanor stared at him. In Philadelphia, a courtship would involve months of supervised visits and chaperoned walks and careful dancing around propriety. But this was not Philadelphia. This was the frontier, where a broken wagon wheel could change the entire course of a life, where a week of cooking for a lonely cowboy could lead to this moment under a blazing sunset. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." Caleb's face broke into that rare transforming smile. "Really? You would not rather wait for some wealthier man or go on to California?" "California was my aunt's dream for me, not my own. And I do not care about wealth, Mr. Stone. I care about kindness, and you have shown me more kindness than anyone since my mother died." "Caleb," he said. "If I am courting you, you should call me Caleb." "Caleb," Eleanor repeated, and liked the way his name felt in her mouth. "And you must call me Eleanor." They walked back to the boarding house slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. At the door, Caleb took her hand and held it gently. "I will come to town every week," he said. "On Sundays, if I can manage it, we will walk and talk, and you can decide if you truly want a life out here with me." "I have already decided," Eleanor said. But she saw the fear behind his eyes, the disbelief that anyone would choose him and his hard, simple life, and she understood that he needed time to trust this fragile new thing between them. "But I will walk with you every Sunday anyway." True to his word, Caleb rode into Sweetwater Creek every Sunday. If the weather was fair, he and Eleanor walked along the creek or out into the hills. If it rained, they sat in the boarding house parlor with Mrs. Chen working quietly in the corner as a chaperone. They talked about everything and nothing. Eleanor told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, her father's work as a printer before he died, her mother's long illness. Caleb spoke haltingly about the war, the friends he lost, the way killing a man changed something fundamental inside a person. "I came west to escape it," he said one October afternoon as they sat beside the creek, watching water skate across the surface. "Thought if I got far enough away I could leave it all behind, but you cannot leave yourself behind. You carry your ghosts wherever you go." Eleanor took his hand. "You are a good man, Caleb. Whatever you did in the war, you did because you were a boy who believed he was fighting for something right. That does not make you a killer now." "How can you be sure?" His voice was raw. "Because I have seen how gentle you are with your horses. How you saved a lost woman without asking anything in return. How you smile when you see a pretty sunset." She squeezed his hand. "A killer does not notice sunsets, Caleb." He turned to her then, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Eleanor Hayes." "You are the best thing that has happened to me too," she whispered. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not pull away. His lips brushed hers, soft and tentative, a question more than a demand. Eleanor answered by kissing him back, her hand coming up to cup his jaw. The kiss deepened, and she felt heat flood through her body, Want and need and something deeper she did not have words for yet. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is too soon, I know I should wait longer, but marry me, Eleanor. Come home with me and make that cabin into something worth living in." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, Caleb, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later when the circuit preacher came through town. It was a simple ceremony in the small church, with Mrs. Chen and Klaus the blacksmith standing as witnesses. Eleanor wore a dress Mrs. Chen helped her sew from blue calico bought at the general store. She carried wildflowers Caleb had picked that morning. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with such tenderness that Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks. Mrs. Chen insisted on hosting a wedding dinner at the boarding house. The whole town came, all 200 residents cramming into the dining room and spilling out into the street. Alice from the saloon brought whiskey. Mr. Patterson gave them a set of dishes. Klaus presented Caleb with a new set of horseshoes for Rosie. Mrs. Chen cried openly and hugged Eleanor so tight she could barely breathe. "You take care of that man," Mrs. Chen whispered in Eleanor's ear. "He has been alone too long. He needs someone to remind him how to be happy." "I will," Eleanor promised. As the sun set, Caleb lifted Eleanor onto Rosie's back and swung up behind her. They rode out of Sweetwater Creek together toward the ranch that was now Eleanor's home. Eleanor's few possessions were packed in saddlebags, including the quilt her mother had made. She had not offered to trade it again, and Caleb had not asked. They reached the cabin in full darkness, guided by moonlight and the stars scattered thick across the sky. Caleb helped Eleanor down from the horse and lit a lamp inside. The cabin looked just as she remembered, small and spare and clean, but now it was hers. Theirs. Caleb seemed suddenly nervous, standing in the middle of the room with his hat still in his hands. Eleanor took the hat gently and hung it on a peg, then reached up to touch his face. "I am not afraid," she said softly. "Are you?" Terrified, Caleb admitted. "What if I am not good enough for you? What if you wake up one morning and regret this?" Eleanor kissed him, stopping the flow of fearful words. "The only thing I regret is that I did not meet you sooner. Now stop worrying and help me unpack." They unrolled the quilt together and spread it across the narrow bed. Eleanor's mother's handiwork glowed in the lamplight, each patch of fabric a small, bright memory. Caleb traced one square with his finger, a piece of blue fabric covered with tiny white stars. "This is beautiful," he said. "Your mother must have loved you very much." "She did." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I wish she could have met you, she would have liked you." "I wish I could have met her too, to thank her for raising such a remarkable daughter." They made love that night wrapped in the quilt, slow and tender and fumbling, two people learning each other's bodies in the flickering lamplight. Eleanor had been frightened of this part, of the unknown territory of marriage, but Caleb was patient and gentle, and by the end she understood why the marriage bed was called a blessing. Afterward they lay tangled together under the quilt, skin to skin, Caleb's arm around her waist and Eleanor's head on his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, and she thought that this was what home sounded like. "Are you happy?" Caleb asked, his voice rumbling under her ear. "Happier than I have been in years," Eleanor said. "Are you?" "I did not think I could be this happy. I thought happiness was for other people, not for men like me." Eleanor tilted her head to look at him. "You deserve happiness, Caleb Stone. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." He kissed the top of her head, and she felt him smile against her hair. "That works out well, because I intend to do the same for you." The winter that followed was harder than Eleanor had imagined. Snow came in November and did not fully melt until March. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the bucket overnight. Caleb taught Eleanor how to split wood and keep the fire going, how to melt snow for water when the creek froze, how to ration their supplies to last until spring. There were days when the wind howled so fiercely that leaving the cabin meant risking death. On those days, they stayed inside, huddled close to the fire. Caleb carved small wooden figures while Eleanor sewed or read aloud from the single book they owned, a battered copy of Shakespeare's plays that had belonged to his mother. They played card games and told each other stories, and made love under the quilt while snow piled against the walls outside. The cattle suffered during the worst storms. Caleb went out even in the most vicious weather to check on them, and Eleanor learned to live with the fear that he might not come back. She waited by the window, watching for him, her heart not settling until she saw his dark figure emerging from the white swirl of snow. "You are going to worry yourself sick," Caleb said one evening after a particularly bad storm. He was half frozen, his lips blue, and Eleanor had wrapped him in every blanket they owned and put hot coffee in his hands. "Then stop scaring me," Eleanor said, but her voice was gentle because she knew he had no choice. The cattle were their livelihood. Without them, they would have nothing. In January, a blizzard swept down from the north and lasted 3 days. The wind screamed like a living thing, and the snow piled so high against the cabin door that they had to dig their way out. When the storm finally broke, Caleb went to check the cattle and came back grim-faced. "Lost 15 head," he said. "Maybe more, I cannot find them all yet." Eleanor's heart sank. 15 cattle was a significant portion of their herd, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We still have most of them, and spring will come, we will recover." Caleb pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "How did I ever manage without you?" "Poorly, I imagine," Eleanor said, and was rewarded with a laugh, but the loss of the cattle meant belt-tightening. They rationed their food more carefully. Caleb took on occasional work for other ranchers, riding out for days at a time to help with branding or roundups, earning a few extra dollars that they hoarded against the lean times. Eleanor learned to hunt small game, rabbits and prairie chickens, to supplement their diet. She set snares near the creek and checked them every morning, her heart leaping with triumph whenever she found something caught. Spring arrived slowly, grudgingly, the snow melting in patches to reveal brown grass underneath. Caleb rode out to tally the surviving cattle and came back with a slightly better number than he had feared. They had lost 18 head total, but the remaining cows were pregnant, and by summer there would be calves to replace what was lost. Eleanor planted a garden behind the cabin, seeds she had bought with hoarded pennies from the general store. Tomatoes and beans and squash and potatoes, things that would grow in the harsh prairie soil if tended carefully. She hauled water from the creek every day and watched with fierce pride as green shoots pushed through the earth. In late May, Eleanor woke feeling queasy. She made it outside before vomiting, and when she came back to the cabin, Caleb was watching her with worried eyes. "Are you sick?" he asked. "Should I ride for the doctor in town?" Eleanor shook her head. The queasiness was already passing, and a sudden certainty had settled over her. "I am not sick, I think I am pregnant." Caleb stared at her. "Pregnant, are you sure?" "Not completely. But I have missed my monthly courses, and I have been tired, and now this." She gestured vaguely at her stomach. "I think we are going to have a baby, Caleb." His face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. Shock, fear, hope, and finally joy so pure it made Eleanor's eyes burn with tears. He crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around. "A baby," he said, his voice choked. "We are going to have a baby." "Careful," Eleanor gasped, laughing. "You are making me dizzy." He set her down gently, immediately anxious. "Did I hurt you?" "Should you be sitting down? What do you need?" "I need you to stop fussing," Eleanor said, but she was smiling. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time, Caleb. I will be fine." He was not convinced. For the rest of the day, he hovered around her, trying to keep her from doing any work. Eleanor finally snapped at him in exasperation, and he retreated, hurt and confused. She found him in the barn that evening, brushing the horses with more vigor than necessary. "I am sorry," she said. "I should not have been cross with you." "I just want to take care of you," Caleb said without looking at her. "You and the baby, what if something happens? There is no doctor out here, no midwife." Eleanor moved to stand beside him. "There is a midwife in Sweetwater Creek. Mrs. Chen told me." A woman named Sarah Bridger. When the time comes, you will ride to town and bring her here, and nothing bad will happen, Caleb. I am strong, and so is our baby." He set down the brush and pulled her close. "I could not bear it if I lost you. You are not going to lose me." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to be a family, you and me and this baby, and we are going to be happy." The pregnancy progressed through the summer. Eleanor's belly swelled slowly, and she felt the baby move for the first time in July, a flutter like butterfly wings inside her. She grabbed Caleb's hand and placed it on her stomach so he could feel it too, and the look of wonder on his face was something she would treasure forever. The garden flourished. They had fresh vegetables for the first time since Eleanor arrived, and she spent long hours preserving what they could not eat, drying beans and making tomato relish and storing potatoes in the root cellar. Caleb's cattle thrived on the summer grass, and the calves grew fat and healthy. It seemed, for a brief golden season, that everything was going to be all right. In August, a wagon train passed within 10 miles of the ranch, and Caleb rode out to trade with them. He came back with coffee and sugar and a small wooden cradle, beautifully carved, that one of the travelers had made during the long journey west. "For the baby," Caleb said, setting the cradle beside the bed. "I know it is early, but I saw it and I could not resist." Eleanor ran her hands over the smooth wood, tears sliding down her cheeks. "It is perfect. Our baby is so lucky to have you as a father." "I am the lucky one," Caleb said. He knelt beside her and kissed her belly. "Both of you make me luckier than any man deserves to be." The baby came in November, a month earlier than Eleanor had expected. The pain started in the middle of the night, waking her from sleep. She gripped Caleb's shoulder, gasping. "The baby," she managed. "It is coming." Caleb bolted upright, instantly awake. "Now, but it is too early." "Babies come when they are ready, not when we want them to." Eleanor breathed through another contraction. "You need to ride to town and get Sarah Bridger. Hurry." Caleb dressed in seconds and ran to the barn. Eleanor heard Rosie's hooves pounding away into the darkness and prayed that he would make it in time. The contractions were coming fast, faster than she had expected for a first baby. She struggled out of bed and paced the cabin, her hand pressed to her lower back, trying to breathe the way Mrs. Chen had told her to. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and fear. Dawn came, gray and cold, and still Caleb had not returned. Eleanor knew something was wrong. The town was only 15 miles away. Even riding through darkness, he should have been back by now. The contractions grew stronger, closer together, until they were almost continuous. Eleanor collapsed onto the bed, biting her lip to keep from screaming. She had never felt pain like this, pain that swallowed her whole and left no room for thought. She heard hoofbeats outside and sobbed with relief. But when the cabin door opened, it was not Caleb. It was Sarah Bridger, the midwife, a sturdy gray-haired woman with kind eyes and capable hands. Behind her came Caleb, his face white with strain. "Rosie went lame a mile from town," he said, stumbling to Eleanor's side. "I had to run the rest of the way. I am sorry, I am so sorry." "You are here now," Eleanor gasped. "That is all that matters." Sarah Bridger took charge immediately. She examined Eleanor, her face calm and professional, then began giving orders. "Boil water, bring clean cloths, build up the fire." Caleb moved like a man in a dream, doing everything he was told. "The baby is coming fast," Sarah said. "Faster than usual for a first child." "I need you to push when I tell you, Eleanor. Can you do that?" Eleanor nodded, beyond words. The next hour was agony. She pushed when Sarah told her to push, gripped Caleb's hand so hard she thought she might break his fingers, and screamed when the pain became too much to contain. Caleb stayed beside her the whole time, murmuring encouragement, wiping her face with a cool cloth, telling her how brave she was, how strong. And then, with one final tremendous push, the baby was born. Eleanor heard a thin wail, and her heart nearly burst. "A boy," Sarah announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A healthy boy." She cleaned the baby quickly and laid him on Eleanor's chest. Eleanor stared down at her son, this tiny red-faced creature with a shock of dark hair and furious blue eyes. He was perfect, absolutely perfect. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one, I am your mother." Caleb was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "He is so small," he said, his voice wondering. "Look how small he is." "He will grow," Sarah said, smiling. "Now let me finish up here, and then I will leave you three alone." She tended to Eleanor, made sure the afterbirth came as it should, and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. She showed Eleanor how to nurse, guiding the baby to her breast until he latched on and began to suckle. The sensation was strange and almost uncomfortable, but Eleanor felt a fierce rush of love so strong it left her dizzy. Sarah stayed through the day to make sure there were no complications, then rode back to town with Caleb's promise that he would bring her payment within the week. Caleb returned to find Eleanor in bed, propped up on pillows with the baby asleep in her arms and the quilt tucked around them both. "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, gazing at his son. "I have been thinking about that. What do you think of Thomas?" "It was my father's name." "Thomas," Eleanor repeated. "Thomas Stone, I like it." "Hello, Thomas." The baby stirred at the sound of his name but did not wake. Caleb reached out tentatively and stroked the tiny head with one finger. "I am going to do everything I can to give him a good life," Caleb said. "I swear it, Eleanor, he is never going to want for anything." "He already has everything he needs," Eleanor said. "He has parents who love him and each other. That is more than many children can say." Caleb leaned down and kissed her, gentle and tender. "I love you, Eleanor Stone, more than I have words to tell you." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered. "Now come lie down with us. Our son should know his father's heartbeat." Caleb stretched out beside them on the narrow bed, and Eleanor carefully shifted so that the baby was nestled between them. Caleb wrapped his arm around both of them and pulled the quilt up over their bodies. The quilt Eleanor's mother had made, the quilt that had traveled all the way from Philadelphia, the quilt that had kept her warm through wagon journeys and prairie walks and the terrible first winter of her marriage. Now it covered her new family, holding them safe and warm. "This quilt has seen a lot," Caleb said, echoing her thoughts. "It brought you to me." "No," Eleanor said. "A broken wagon wheel brought me to you. The quilt just kept me from freezing before I got there." Caleb smiled. "I suppose that is true. Either way, I am grateful." Thomas began to fuss, a small sound that quickly escalated to a wail. Eleanor lifted him and offered her breast again, and he quieted immediately, nursing with single-minded intensity. Caleb watched them, and Eleanor saw something ease in his face, some old fear finally laid to rest. "We are really doing this," he said. "We are really a family." "Yes," Eleanor said. "We really are." The first winter with a baby was even harder than Eleanor's first winter on the ranch. Thomas woke every few hours to nurse, and Eleanor stumbled through the days exhausted and milk-stained. Caleb helped as much as he could, taking the baby when Eleanor needed sleep, walking the floor with Thomas when he fussed, changing soiled cloths without complaint. But there was still work that had to be done. Cattle to tend, wood to split, food to cook, endless chores that could not be postponed because of a crying infant. Eleanor learned to work with Thomas tied to her back in a sling Sarah Bridger had shown her how to make. She cooked one-handed while nursing him. She fell asleep sitting up, waking in a panic to find Caleb had taken the baby from her arms and put him safely in the cradle. "You cannot keep going like this," Caleb said one January afternoon. Eleanor had been awake for 36 hours straight or close to it, because Thomas seemed to have decided that nighttime was for crying and daytime was for nursing constantly. "You are going to make yourself sick." "What choice do I have?" Eleanor asked. She was so tired she could barely focus her eyes. "The baby needs me." "The baby needs you healthy. Get in bed, I will take him for a few hours." "But he is hungry, he needs to nurse." "Then I will bring him to you when he is hungry, but in between you are going to sleep." Eleanor was too exhausted to argue. She crawled into bed fully dressed and was asleep before her head hit the pillow. When she woke, The cabin was dark and Caleb was sitting in the rocking chair he had built during her pregnancy, holding Thomas and singing softly. It was a song Eleanor did not recognize, something about rivers and mountains, probably from Caleb's childhood. She lay still, watching them. Her husband and her son, the two people she loved most in all the world. Caleb looked up and saw her awake. "Feel better?" he asked. "Much." "How long did I sleep?" "6 hours. He nursed once. I brought him to you, but you barely woke up." Eleanor sat up, amazed. 6 hours was more continuous sleep than she had gotten since Thomas was born. "Did he cry?" "A little. I walked with him and sang to him, and he settled down." Caleb stood and brought Thomas to her. "I think he might be wet, though. That is beyond my skills." Eleanor laughed and changed the baby, then nursed him while Caleb made dinner. They ate together, the three of them, Thomas asleep in his cradle and Caleb and Eleanor talking about nothing in particular. It was ordinary and domestic and utterly perfect. Spring came again, and Thomas grew from a helpless newborn into a baby who could hold his head up and smile and grab at things with his tiny fists. He laughed for the first time in April, a sound so joyful that Eleanor burst into tears. Caleb tickled the baby's stomach to make him laugh again, and Thomas obliged, giggling until he got the hiccups. Eleanor's garden came back to life, and this year she planted twice as much because they had a child to feed now and children needed good food to grow strong. Caleb's cattle had survived another winter, and this year's calf crop was the best yet. They sold half the yearlings in late summer to a cattle buyer passing through, and for the first time since homesteading, Caleb had real money in his pocket. "We could buy furniture," he said, holding the cash like it might disappear. "A proper table and chairs, maybe a dresser, or we could save it for lean times." "A little of both," Eleanor suggested. "We need a few things to make life easier, but we should save most of it. Another bad winter could wipe us out if we are not careful." They compromised. Caleb built a larger table and 2 benches for the cabin, and Eleanor bought fabric from the general store to make curtains and a proper dress for herself, the first new clothing she had owned since arriving in Nebraska. They saved the rest of the money in a coffee tin hidden under a floorboard, their nest egg against disaster. In September, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. She told Caleb while they were sitting outside after dinner, watching Thomas toddle around the yard chasing grasshoppers. Caleb froze with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "Another baby," he said. "Already?" "Babies tend to come when they come," Eleanor said. She was not entirely happy about it herself. Thomas was not yet a year old, and the thought of going through sleepless nights and constant nursing again so soon was daunting. But she was also excited. Thomas would have a sibling close in age, someone to play with as they grew. "Are you all right with this?" Caleb asked carefully. Eleanor considered the question honestly. "I am tired at the thought of it, but yes, I am all right. Another baby is a blessing, even if the timing is not ideal." Caleb set down his coffee and pulled her close. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known. You came west with nothing but a quilt and built a whole life out here. You are going to be fine, and so is our new baby." "Our babies," Eleanor corrected, nodding toward Thomas, who had fallen on his bottom and was considering whether to cry about it. He decided against it and went back to chasing grasshoppers. The second pregnancy was harder than the first. Eleanor was chasing a toddler while growing another baby, and she felt exhausted all the time. Her back ached constantly. She could not eat much because Thomas's constant motion made her queasy. Caleb tried to help, but he had his own work that could not be neglected. In November, just after Thomas's first birthday, a letter arrived from California. Eleanor's aunt had finally responded to the letter Eleanor had sent months ago, announcing her marriage. The letter was brief and cold. The aunt was disappointed that Eleanor had married a cowboy instead of coming to California as planned. She felt her generosity had been thrown back in her face. She wished Eleanor well but made it clear that she wanted no further contact. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it and put it away. She felt nothing or almost nothing. A faint echo of the grief she had once carried for her lost family, but it was distant now, an old wound that had scarred over. Her family was here in this cabin, Caleb and Thomas and the new baby growing inside her. She needed nothing else. The second baby, a girl they named Margaret after Eleanor's mother, arrived in May of 1874. The birth was faster and easier than Thomas's had been, and Sarah Bridger proclaimed Eleanor a natural at childbearing. Eleanor, lying exhausted in bed with her newborn daughter in her arms, laughed weakly. "If this is natural, I would hate to see what is unnatural." Margaret was smaller than Thomas had been, and quieter. She slept for long stretches and nursed efficiently, as if she understood her mother had limited time and energy. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister. He wanted to hold her constantly, and Eleanor had to teach him to be gentle, to support her head, to sit down before taking her in his arms. "Baby," Thomas said, one of his few clear words. "My baby." "Our baby," Eleanor corrected gently. "You are her big brother, you have to help take care of her." Thomas took this job very seriously. He brought Margaret his favorite toys and patted her head when she cried. When she was old enough to smile, she smiled at Thomas more than anyone else, and his face would light up with pride. Caleb watched his children with an expression Eleanor could not quite decipher. Love, certainly, and pride, but also something else, something almost like fear. "What are you thinking?" She asked him one evening as they sat outside, Margaret asleep in Eleanor's arms and Thomas drowsing against Caleb's chest. "I am thinking about how much I have," Caleb said slowly, "and how much I have to lose. You and Thomas and Margaret, you are everything to me. If something happened to any of you—" "Nothing is going to happen," Eleanor said firmly. "We are careful and we are strong and we take care of each other. That is all we can do, Caleb. Live our lives and love each other and trust that it will be enough." "It is more than enough," Caleb said. "It is everything." The years rolled forward, each one marked by small triumphs and minor disasters. A harsh winter that killed more cattle than they could afford to lose. A summer so dry the garden withered despite Eleanor's best efforts. A fall when the cattle prices were so good that Caleb came home from the market with enough money to build a second room onto the cabin. Thomas grew into a serious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. Margaret was quieter, more thoughtful, but with a laugh that could light up the darkest day. In 1876, when Thomas was 4 and Margaret was 2, Eleanor gave birth to another boy whom they named Samuel. In 1878, a second daughter arrived, Rose, named for Caleb's mother. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family. Caleb added a loft for the older children to sleep in, and then a separate room for the girls when Rose outgrew the cradle. The ranch grew as well. Caleb hired 2 hands to help with the cattle, and the herd increased to over 300 head. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable, with enough to eat and a solid roof over their heads. Eleanor's life was consumed by the endless work of raising 4 children on a frontier ranch. Cooking, cleaning, mending, teaching the children to read and write and do sums, tending the garden that now fed 7 people, preserving food for winter, sewing clothes from fabric she ordered from the catalog when they could afford it. She fell into bed exhausted every night and woke every morning to do it all again, but she was happy. Tired and busy and sometimes overwhelmed, but happy. She had built something here, something real and lasting. A home, a family, a life that mattered. The quilt her mother had made was showing its age. The fabric had faded and thinned, and some of the patches had torn despite Eleanor's careful mending. But she could not bring herself to put it away. It still covered their bed every night, wrapping Eleanor and Caleb in memories of where they had come from and how far they had traveled. One evening in the summer of 1880, Eleanor sat on the porch mending the quilt yet again. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter drifting on the warm air. Caleb came and sat beside her, watching her work. "That quilt is not going to last much longer," he said gently. "I know." Eleanor's throat tightened. "But I cannot give it up. It is the last thing I have of my mother." You have more than that, Caleb said. You have her strength and her kindness and her love. Those are not going to wear out, no matter how old the quilt gets. Eleanor set down her needle and leaned against his shoulder. Do you remember the first time we used this quilt together? The night we were married. I remember everything about that night, Caleb said. His arm came around her waist. I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive and wondering when you would realize you had made a terrible mistake. I never thought that, Eleanor said. Not for one moment. I know. You have given me 10 years of happiness, Eleanor. 10 years I never thought I would have. You and our children, you saved me. Eleanor turned to look at him. There was gray in his hair now and lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. He looked older than the lonely cowboy who had found her standing at the edge of his clearing with nothing but a quilt and hope. But the way he looked at her had not changed. We saved each other, she said. I would have died on the prairie if you had not taken me in. We were both lost and we found each other. Caleb kissed her, slow and sweet, a kiss that held a decade of love and trust. When they pulled apart, Thomas was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, grinning. Father is kissing Mother, he announced to his siblings. That is what married people do, Margaret informed him loftily. At 6, she considered herself an expert on all adult behavior. Are you going to kiss when you get married? Samuel asked Thomas. No, Thomas said firmly. Kissing is gross. Eleanor and Caleb looked at each other and laughed. Caleb stood and scooped Samuel into his arms. You will change your mind about that when you are older. Now, who wants to help me check the horses? All 4 children clamored to go with him. Caleb herded them toward the barn and Eleanor watched them go, her heart full. This was her life now. This loud, chaotic, exhausting, beautiful life, and she would not trade it for anything. That night, after the children were asleep in their beds, Eleanor and Caleb lay together under the quilt. Caleb traced the faded patches with his finger. Do you ever regret it? He asked quietly. Coming west. Marrying me, giving up the life you could have had in California? Never, Eleanor said without hesitation. This is the life I was meant to have. You are the man I was meant to love. I knew it the first time you wrapped this quilt around both of us. I do not remember doing that, Caleb said, confused. It was later. That first winter after we were married. Eleanor smiled at the memory. We were outside trying to fix a broken fence post and a storm came in fast. We ran for the cabin, but we were both half frozen by the time we got inside. You pulled the quilt off the bed and wrapped it around both of us, holding me tight until we stopped shivering. I remember thinking that this was what love felt like, being held close and kept warm, even in the coldest winter. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I do remember that. You were shaking so hard I thought you might fall apart. I was terrified I had let you get too cold, that you would get sick and die because I had not protected you properly. But you did protect me. You wrapped us both tight in this quilt and kept me safe. Eleanor kissed his jaw. You have been keeping me safe ever since. We keep each other safe, Caleb said. He pulled her closer and the quilt settled around them both, soft and worn and perfect. That is what partners do. In the years that followed, life continued its rhythm of seasons and growth. Thomas grew tall and serious, learning to work cattle alongside his father. Margaret developed a love of books and a gift for drawing, sketching the prairie landscape in a notebook Eleanor ordered for her birthday. Samuel was the adventurous one, always climbing trees and exploring the creek, and coming home muddy and triumphant. Rose was the baby, spoiled by her older siblings and adored by everyone. Sweetwater Creek grew as well. More families arrived, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity. A schoolhouse was built, and a new church to replace the old one. The railroad came through in 1882, and suddenly the isolation that had defined frontier life began to ease. Eleanor could order fabric and thread and books from Omaha, and they arrived in weeks instead of months. In 1883, Thomas turned 13 and announced he wanted to start his own small herd. Caleb gave him 10 head of cattle and helped him build a separate corral. Eleanor watched her firstborn becoming a man and felt the bittersweet ache of pride mixed with sorrow. He was growing up. They all were. Margaret started attending the new school in town, riding in each day with 3 other ranch children. She came home full of stories about her teacher, Miss Albright, and the other students. Eleanor listened and encouraged, even though part of her mourned the loss of teaching her children herself. The ranch continued to prosper. Caleb expanded the herd to over 500 head and hired 4 permanent hands. They built a bunkhouse for the hands and a larger barn. The cabin was expanded again, adding a proper parlor and a separate kitchen. Eleanor finally had a real cook stove instead of the fireplace, and she nearly cried with joy the first time she used it. In 1885, tragedy struck. A late spring storm caught Caleb and 2 of his hands out with the cattle. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour and lightning struck all around them. One of the hands was killed instantly. Caleb made it home, but he was suffering from exposure and a bad cough that would not go away. Eleanor nursed him through the illness, terrified she would lose him. She made him stay in bed despite his protests. She brewed medicinal teas from herbs Sarah Bridger provided. She sat beside him at night, listening to him breathe, praying to a God she rarely spoke to. It took 6 weeks, but Caleb recovered. He was thinner and weaker than before, and the cough lingered for months, but he lived. When he was finally strong enough to sit up and argue about staying in bed, Eleanor knew he would be all right. "I thought I was going to lose you," she said one evening, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I thought you were going to leave me alone with 4 children and a ranch to run." "I would never leave you if I had a choice," Caleb said. He took her hand. "But we cannot control everything, Eleanor. Death comes when it comes." "Then it can wait a good long while before coming for you again," Eleanor said fiercely. "I am not done with you yet, Caleb Stone." He smiled, that same transforming smile that had captivated her 15 years ago. "Good, because I am nowhere near done with you either." In 1887, when Thomas was 17, he asked permission to court Clara Peterson, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Caleb gave his blessing, and Eleanor tried not to think about how soon she might lose her oldest son to marriage and a homestead of his own. But Clara was a sweet girl, hardworking and kind, and she clearly adored Thomas. Eleanor could not ask for better for her boy. Margaret announced she wanted to become a teacher. She was 14 and already helping Miss Albright with the younger students. Eleanor and Caleb discussed sending her to the normal school in Lincoln, but the expense and the distance gave them pause. In the end, they decided to wait another year, save more money, and revisit the question. Samuel, at 12, showed no interest in ranching. He was fascinated by machines and mechanisms, taking apart clocks and farm equipment to see how they worked. Caleb was baffled but supportive, and Eleanor wondered if Samuel would eventually leave the ranch for a city where his interests could flourish. Rose, at 10, was simply happy. She loved the ranch and the horses and her family, and she had not yet reached the age where she questioned her place in the world. Eleanor treasured her youngest daughter's innocence, knowing how quickly it would fade. One autumn evening in 1888, Eleanor sat on the porch with the quilt in her lap. It was truly threadbare now, held together more by hope and memory than by actual fabric. She was trying to decide if it could be mended one more time when Caleb came and sat beside her. "It is time, is it not?" he said gently. "Time to retire that old quilt. I suppose it is." Eleanor ran her hands over the faded patches. "But I do not know how to let it go. It feels like letting go of my mother all over again." "Then do not let it go entirely. Take the patches that can be saved and make something new, a pillow cover maybe, or a small blanket. Something you can keep and use without worrying about it falling apart completely." Eleanor looked at him, and her eyes filled with tears. "That is a wonderful idea, thank you." Over the next few weeks, Eleanor carefully took apart the quilt. Some patches were too worn to save, but many were still intact. She pieced them together into a smaller quilt, barely big enough to cover a single person, and backed it with new fabric. When she finished, she had a tangible piece of her mother's love, transformed but still present. She and Caleb used a new quilt on their bed, a wedding gift from Margaret, who had learned to sew beautifully. But Eleanor kept her mother's quilt, the small version, folded at the foot of the bed. And sometimes, on cold nights, she would pull it up over both of them and remember the woman who had stitched it with love and the journey that had brought her to this life. By 1890, Eleanor and Caleb had been married for 18 years. Thomas married Clara in a beautiful ceremony in the new church, and they homesteaded land 10 miles south with help from both families. Margaret left for normal school in Lincoln, writing long letters home describing her classes and her new friends. Samuel apprenticed with Klaus the blacksmith, learning metalwork and welding. Rose, at 12, was talking about becoming a doctor, a dream so audacious that Eleanor did not know whether to encourage it or prepare her daughter for disappointment. Eleanor was 42 years old and Caleb was 44. They had gray in their hair and lines on their faces and work-worn hands. They had survived blizzards and droughts, sickness and loss, the endless grinding work of building a life from nothing. And they had built something remarkable. A family, a ranch, a legacy. One warm September evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set in a glory of orange and gold. The children were grown, or nearly so, the ranch was thriving, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with accomplishment and everything to do with contentment. "You remember," Caleb said, "the day you showed up at the edge of my clearing. You were so stubborn, insisting you did not need charity, offering to work for a horse. I remember you looking at my quilt and offering to trade for it," Eleanor said. "I was so offended. That quilt was all I had left. And now it has seen us through nearly 2 decades of marriage." Caleb took her hand. "I am glad you kept it, and I am glad you kept me. I am glad too." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "This life we built, it is not what I imagined when I left Philadelphia. It is so much better. Better than California," Caleb teased. "Better than anywhere else in the world," Eleanor said seriously. "Because you are here and our children are here and this is home." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the stars emerged. Inside the house, Rose was reading by lamplight. Somewhere to the south, Thomas and Clara were starting their own life together. In Lincoln, Margaret was studying to shape young minds. At the blacksmith's, Samuel was learning a trade. Their family had spread and grown, roots sinking deep into the prairie soil. "We did good, did we not?" Caleb said quietly. "We did," Eleanor agreed. "We did very good indeed." The years continued to pass, each one adding more threads to the tapestry of their life. In 1892, Thomas and Clara welcomed their first child, a boy they named Caleb after his grandfather. Eleanor held her grandson and felt the profound joy of seeing her family continue into a new generation. Caleb, holding his namesake with the same tentative wonder he had shown with his own children, looked at Eleanor with tears in his eyes. "We made this," he said. "All of this. From one broken wagon and a quilt and 2 people who needed each other." "We did," Eleanor whispered, "and it is beautiful." Margaret returned from normal school in 1893 with her teaching certificate and took a position at the Sweetwater Creek School. She boarded with Mrs. Chen, who was elderly now but still sharp as ever. Samuel opened a small workshop in town, repairing farm equipment and building custom metalwork. Rose, defying all expectations, left for medical school in Omaha, one of only 3 women in her class. The ranch continued to thrive under Caleb's management, though he increasingly turned over the day-to-day operations to his foreman. He and Eleanor had time now to simply enjoy each other's company, to take long walks along the creek, to sit on the porch and watch the grandchildren play when Thomas and Clara visited. In 1895, on their 23rd wedding anniversary, Caleb gave Eleanor a gift. It was a new quilt, sewn by all 4 of their children working together. Each child had contributed patches made from fabric that held meaning. A piece of Thomas's wedding shirt, fabric from Margaret's first teaching dress, scraps from Rose's medical school application papers, and steel-colored cloth Samuel had dyed himself. "It is to replace your mother's quilt," Margaret explained when they presented it. Not to erase it, but to honor it. We wanted you to have something that represents our family now, the family you and Father built. Eleanor could not speak through her tears. She wrapped the new quilt around herself, then opened her arms and pulled all 4 of her children close. Caleb joined them, his arms encircling the whole family, and Eleanor felt complete in a way she had not known was possible. That night, she and Caleb lay under both quilts, the small remnant of her mother's love and the new quilt their children had made. 2 generations of love stitched and sewn and wrapped around them. "I cannot believe how lucky we got," Caleb said. "That wagon wheel breaking, you walking to my ranch, all of it. What if you had gone a different direction? What if you had reached Sweetwater Creek without stopping here? We would never have met." "I think we would have found each other somehow," Eleanor said. "Some things are meant to be, Caleb." "We were meant to be." He kissed her, and they made love slowly with the tenderness of long familiarity and deep love. Afterward, wrapped together under the quilts, Eleanor felt the circle complete. From her mother's love stitched into fabric, through her own journey west and the chance meeting that changed her life, to the children they created and the legacy they built. All of it connected, all of it meaningful. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Caleb asked sleepily. "For wrapping us both tight in that quilt, for keeping us warm, for making a home with me." Eleanor snuggled closer. "For everything." "Thank you for saying yes," Caleb replied. "For staying, for loving me even when I did not think I deserved to be loved. For giving me a family and a reason to wake up every morning." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in quilts in each other's arms, 2 people who had found their way through hardship to happiness, through loss to love, through a vast empty prairie to home. The years rolled on into a new century. In 1900, as the world celebrated the turn of the millennium, Eleanor and Caleb celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children and growing number of grandchildren. Thomas and Clara had 5 children now. Margaret had married a teacher from Lincoln and they had 2 children. Samuel married a woman who ran a boarding house and they had 3 children. Even Rose, after finishing medical school, married a fellow doctor and had a baby girl. The original cabin had been expanded so many times it was barely recognizable. A sprawling ranch house with multiple bedrooms and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The ranch itself covered thousands of acres, and the cattle herd numbered in the thousands. What Caleb had started with nothing but determination and hard work had become a true empire, though he would never use that word. "It is just a ranch," he would say when people marveled at what he had built. "And I did not build it alone. Eleanor did half the work and the children did the rest." In 1902, Eleanor turned 54 years old. She had gray hair now, worn in a simple bun, and her hands were gnarled from decades of hard work. But her eyes were still bright and her spirit was undiminished. She had seen her children grow and thrive, had held grandchildren in her arms, had built a life that mattered. Caleb, at 56, moved a bit slower than he once had. His war injury bothered him on cold days, and the years of hard ranch work had taken their toll. But he was still strong, still capable, and still deeply in love with his wife. One evening in late autumn, they sat together on the porch watching the sun set. It was their ritual now, this quiet time at the end of the day. Inside, the house was empty and silent. All the children were grown and gone, living their own lives. It was just Eleanor and Caleb again, the way it had been in the beginning. "Do you ever miss it?" Eleanor asked. "When the house was full of children and noise and chaos." "Sometimes," Caleb admitted, "but I like this too. Just the 2 of us. It feels like we have come full circle back to where we started." "Except we have a much nicer house now," Eleanor said with a smile, "and a lot more cattle, and a lot more quilts." Caleb gestured to the collection of blankets they kept for when the grandchildren visited. "I think we have about 30 quilts at last count." 32, Eleanor corrected. "Rose sent 2 more last week." They laughed together, the easy laughter of people who had shared a lifetime. As the sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the broken wagon wheel that had stranded her. For the lonely cowboy who had taken her in. For the quilt her mother had made that had kept her warm through the journey. For every moment of joy and sorrow and ordinary life in between. "I love you," she said to Caleb. "I have loved you for 28 years, and I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Caleb said. He reached for her hand and she took it, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor Stone, the very best thing." As night fell over the ranch, they sat together in the gathering darkness, wrapped in each other's presence and the warmth of a love that had endured everything the frontier could throw at them. Inside the house, the quilts waited, each one a testament to love and family and the threads that bound them all together. Outside, the prairie stretched away in all directions, vast and beautiful and home. Eleanor leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. The lowing of cattle in the distance, the rustle of wind through the grass, the steady beating of her husband's heart. This was her life. This was her love. This was everything she had ever needed. And it had all started with a quilt, a broken wagon wheel, and a cowboy who had wrapped them both tight and kept them warm.